Thank you, Ernest. So I was charged with providing a bit of an introductory piece to launch us off academically. So I've entitled this, "The Theory and Empirics of Africa's Economic Transformation, How Far Do They Take Us?" I was also an editor of the 6 country case studies, African country case studies that are going to be presented tomorrow. So one of my goals is to give a little bit of a flavor of those case studies without totally ruining the story. Just some acknowledgements. Paul DeRoche is what I've called my eventual co-author. He was a little busy organizing the conference the last couple of weeks. So I don't know whether this should be, acknowledgements or a caveat that maybe he doesn't want to subscribe to everything I'm saying here. But we've been back and forth over this, but we're going to work more on this paper. And then just some other thank yous. I don't have much time, so I'll just list them. But thank everybody for all the hard work and also for sending me some data and so on. So just an overview. I have fairly modest goals. One of the ideas is to give an overview of concepts, what we kind of mean by transformation. A very brief summary of economic theory. I could probably talk for 3 or 4 hours on economic theory, but I'll give you a very brief summary. Then first order evidence on Africa's transformation, including some comparison of these 6 country case studies, which coincide with IFPRI's country programs in Africa. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about some of the knowledge gaps, at least some of the key knowledge gaps that I perceive in this area. So in terms of concepts, well, I guess the first thing is, what do we mean by transformation and why do we care? African economies are growing, especially in the last 10 years. The cities are certainly expanding. A friend of mine in Ethiopia called mobile phones the fastest growing disease in Africa. There's definitely more roads in some parts of Africa, and there's certainly more globalization. But many people feel this is growth without transformation. In other words, Africa continues to export primary products. Its manufacturing sector is minuscule, and although this services sector is expanding, people often feel that it's a very unskilled services sector, and that's not really a desirable transformation. So evidently there's more than one type of transformation that we're talking about. Timmer and others have talked about at least 3 types of economic transformations that take place in the course of development, and to that you could probably add a 4th, the demographic transition, which is the bulge of youth through some stage of development. And these transformations are overlapping, but as the case studies especially show, they're certainly not synonymous. And I think we also ideally want all these transformations to take place. When one happens without the others, it usually signals that something is wrong. So what are these 4 transformations? 3 economics and 1 development. Well, first of all, there's the traditional output transformation. That's a transition out of agriculture into industry or services. The same kind of thing can happen with occupational transformation, people moving out of agriculture, sometimes into rural non-farm economy, sometimes into the urban areas. And then there's a rural-urban transformation, which is more about changes in location and increasing population density. Well, I mentioned that these are overlapping, as the spheres are intended to show, but they're not necessarily synonymous. So as the case studies show, there are some examples where you can have output transformation without occupational transformation. For example, in Mozambique, where there have been some major mega projects in the last 10 years that have definitely changed the output composition and export composition of Mozambique, but not necessarily employment, because they're not labor intensive. In Nigeria, and to some extent Ghana and Uganda and other African countries, we've also seen some output transformation and occupational and some rural-urban transformation, but not much transformation in output, or not much, if you like, desirable transformation in output, or what Schengen called urbanization without industrialization. And then in Asia, in other work, we've shown that there's been output transformation, but quite sluggish transformation from rural to urban areas, partly because of a very strong rural non-farm economy. So that's just a conceptual framework to give you some idea of what we mean by these different transformations. And then I think there's also a cross-cutting demographic transition, this bulge in the youth's proportion in the total demographic structure, but it's not very clear about how that interacts with these other transformations. So this kind of framework raises these questions. Why do countries transform the way they do? What impact does the transformation have on growth, poverty, and sustainability issues? In other words, why does transformation matter? Well, in terms of theory, 2 central questions of development economics right from the very beginning, if you think back to Lewis and Hirschman and others, what kind of economic transformation do we want? And then also the more difficult question perhaps, how do we catalyze that transformation? We know, obviously, that advanced economies look very different from underdeveloped economies. They have big services sectors, sometimes bigger industrial sectors, and a very small agricultural sector. So we know that that's what poor countries should eventually look like, but we don't know how they get there or what conditions the speed and pattern of transition. Initially, I was going to bore you with a long lit review, starting with Hirschman and Lewis and others and go on and on. But what I'm going to try and do is very crudely synthesize some points of possible consensus or debate. So I think there's some consensus on what is a first best path for how to grow quickly, how to get poverty reduction, how to become an advanced economy. First of all, you want to see a shrinking of agriculture's share in GDP to be replaced by an expansion of labor-intensive manufacturing in the early stages. And I've called this a foray into manufacturing. Second, you want to see some evolution of labor-intensive manufacturing into more sophisticated capital and knowledge-intensive manufacturing as cheap labor drives up. I would call this scaling up the technological ladder. And then eventually a rising share of services driven by higher incomes, comparative advantage, etc. And this is kind of a knowledge economy. I think mostly economists feel this is first best because manufacturing has special properties. If I was going to write a paper on this, I would call it, why do economists like sweatshops? So sweatshops are very unpopular with other people, but labor-intensive manufacturing has often been emphasized by economists at early stages of development. And why is that? Well, let's think about these different sectors. I've crudely broken this up into 5 types of sectors on the left-hand side column, and then 2 types of outcomes that we want. One is the kind of dynamic evolutionary growth potential of a sector, and the second is poverty reduction and job creation. And when different economists talk about the various advantages of different sectors, they sometimes have one outcome more in mind than the other. So some people are more growth-oriented. Certainly in IFPRI, we think about growth, but we also have a strong emphasis on poverty reduction and job creation. So in terms of these sectors, agriculture's dynamic or evolutionary growth potential has been long debated. If you go back to Lewis, Rannis and Fay, they think of surplus labor, weak economies of scale and density in the new economic geography literature, weak demand in terms of Prebisch and Singer, weak learning spillovers. HR refers to Hausman and Roderick, who's speaking next. For example, there's an argument that agricultural goods don't lead much to manufacturing, don't lead much to higher value output. And also agriculture is also difficult to transform. It's very decentralized. You're dealing with the peasantry, very poor market access, very poor education. It's just difficult to transform. On the other hand, maybe agriculture has a possible link into manufacturing, and even if you go back into Rannis and Fay, there's all sorts of other linkages too in terms of food prices, freeing up labor and capital to move into the urban sector and so on. In contrast to that, agriculture's potential for poverty reduction is pretty well demonstrated to be very good. Most poor people live in rural areas. All poor people spend a lot of money on food. So agriculture is critical for poverty reduction. That's less controversial. In terms of mining and unskilled services, I don't know of an economic school that says, yeah, mining's a great way to transform. We know all about problems with Dutch disease, corruption with the mining sector. It's very capital intensive, so the effects on poverty are weak. Unskilled services, same kind of story. It's regarded as having very few learning spillovers and so on. Whereas manufacturing, traditionally people think, well, there's strong economies of scale and density in manufacturing, there's stronger demand for manufacturing goods and stronger learning spillovers over time. So even if you start producing t-shirts today, eventually you might start producing computers. And in terms of poverty reduction, not bad. And then high-tech manufacturing and services is something you would ideally want to get into later on in development. So in other words, manufacturing has these special properties, and that's one of the reasons why economists have traditionally emphasized it. So I think this is a good kind of first best theory or transformation path, and it largely fits many of the Asian success stories. But there are probably 2 limitations. One is it's still not clear what the role of agriculture is. Do we need within-sector agricultural transformation to get intersectoral transformation? And the second is there's some real-world snags, especially in Africa. The first, especially in the last 20, 30 years, and certainly today, there's a lot of cheap labor in China and Asia. Can Africa compete in manufacturing? The second is resource abundance. It's all very well to say mining's a sector with weak linkages, but when you have tons of oil sitting in the ground or on the coast, you can't just ignore it. Third is small domestic markets. Obviously there are some exceptions. Nigeria and Ethiopia and DRC are big exceptions, but a lot of African countries are quite small, so they have small domestic markets. And fourth, you could argue that there's a weak capacity or even scope for industrial policy. With joining the WTO and other international organizations and trade agreements, there's less room now for industrial policy than there was 30 or 40 years ago, arguably. Education, infrastructure, credit, entrepreneurship, you could list all sorts of constraints to industrial policy and industrial development. And I think 1 to 4, they're not inevitable, but these are sizable hurdles. So you can argue that countries can make their own comparative advantage, but still these are obstacles. And this begs the question, should African countries try to overcome these hurdles, or should they pursue other paths? Perhaps some countries in Africa look enough like Asia, these big markets, Ethiopia, Nigeria, maybe Ghana. But for others, we don't seem to have the kind of alternative theory of how they should transform or what path they should take. Especially since structural adjustment, African countries no longer have obvious industrial policies. They've tried ISI in the 1960s and 70s, that's import substitution industrialization, but that's no longer considered an appropriate policy. And this lack of industrial policy is obviously a bit of a disconnect with economic theory, because a lot of economic theory says there is a rationale for governments to intervene in changing the sectoral output. And also empirical evidence from Asia that industrial policies there made a difference. If you think about things like Robert Wade's book on Taiwan, Amsden's work on South Korea, and others. But then given these real-world snags, industrial policies in Africa obviously need to go beyond industry manufacturing and maybe think, well, how do we deal with the other sectors? For example, in resource-abundant countries, there's a question, okay, we can take the earnings from natural resources, but where do we spend them? And what other sectors do we try and develop? And in countries with manufacturing potential, the industrial question is, why is this sector so underdeveloped? And that's certainly a key question in countries like Ghana. And in countries that we think of as only having agriculture, maybe this is Malawi or at the moment Ethiopia, the industrial policy question is, how do we make agriculture more profitable? I think the good news is that successful countries have pursued industrial policies in agriculture. China, Taiwan, there's a China story today or tomorrow, and other countries as well. But normally industrial policy is considered to be, well, how do we scale up manufacturing? But maybe we need to broaden our thinking there and talk about marketing, value chains, and commercialization, and so on. Okay, I want to quickly give you some stylized facts of Africa's 3 transformations. Whenever I talk to non-economists and they say, what's the stylized fact? And I can only think it's a fact that's generally true, but not always true. And I suppose, technically speaking, it's not a fact at all. So I'm going to talk about some broad generalizations, but also variation across Africa, which is, I think, very important. So I've suggested the following. We want these 4 transformations to take place together. In a first best world, we want strong growth in manufacturing at early stages of development. And ideally, we also want agricultural transformation, both as an end in itself for poverty reduction and as a step towards intersectoral transformation. So the question I'm asking here is, how do these transformation patterns, these idealized ones, match up against the actual experience in Africa? Okay, first, I think the first fact, there's very little transformation in output, especially towards manufacturing. Schengen mentioned this. What I've done here is to break up African regions and compare them to Asian regions, the sectoral structure in 1970 to 2009. And you'll see that agriculture has shrunk, but rather moderately. In Central Africa, a big growth in the mining share. In East Africa, not much transformation, but big growth in services. Southern Africa, also some growth in mining, big services sector. Western Africa, not much transformation either. And you can see that's a total contrast to Asia. In China, of course, a huge growth in the manufacturing sector. That's the red bar there. And a slightly more modest story in Southeast Asia and South Asia, but definitely strong manufacturing growth and now, of course, increasingly services growth, especially in South Asia. What about Africa's recent growth spurt? So Africa's done very well in the last 10 years. Maybe things are changing. Actually, the data don't really suggest that. If you look, this is sources of growth. So all the bars add up to the total annual growth rate. And you'll see in Central Africa, it's driven by mining. In East Africa, a combination of services, but also some agriculture. West Africa, agriculture has been a really big driver of growth, especially Nigeria. Services also big. And again, that's totally different to China, for example, where manufacturing is driving a lot of it, and also Southeast Asia, where manufacturing services are very strong. And added to that, I would add, there's obviously not much diversification of exports too. I haven't included that data here, but the diversification of exports is another desirable outcome we want, but really seeing yet in Africa. Fact two, in terms of the kind of rural-urban transformation, I think this is very complex in Africa. It's hard to generalize, but this is a graph from a paper I did a couple of years ago with Peter Hazel. On the bottom axis, you'll see GDP per capita, and the lines start in 1960 and end in 2000. So you can see here a country's growth rate implicitly, and also see their urbanization outcomes on the y-axis. And you'll see Nigeria, for example, basically has had very little economic growth, especially since 1980, but seems to have continued urbanizing. Of course, there's all these caveats with the UN urbanization data, but this story looks broadly right for Nigeria. It's a slightly less dramatic story for other African countries, but again, from 1980 to 2000, they seem to continue urbanizing without having economic growth. And in Asia, it's mostly the opposite story with the exception of the Philippines. So they seem to have had relatively modest urbanization, but very fast economic growth. And this seems to be partly due with a very strong rural non-farm economy and maybe some kind of rural agglomeration economies as well. Within Africa, though, there's very different urbanization levels and trends. You can see that Western and Central Africa started out more urbanized in 1950 from that graph, and has also continued to urbanize more quickly. Eastern Africa is still very under-urbanized. And we also compared this urbanization data to GIS data on agglomeration, which isn't sensitive to changing definitions of what is urban, what is rural. And it certainly doesn't contradict the whole story, although interestingly, Ghana seems to have a big difference. It seems to be less urbanized than we think. The agglomeration share, this is based on population density and market access, is only 34%, whereas the official urbanization share is about 44%. And one of the paradoxes, though, we always talk about fast urbanization in Africa, but despite urbanization, there are very few big cities. Nigeria is the only real exception. It has kind of 30 cities of greater than 100,000, or maybe some more. And it has big cities. It has one very big city, Lagos, and some big secondary cities. In other African countries, we don't see these secondary cities. Uganda and Ethiopia are really spectacular examples. I mean, Ethiopia has 80 million people almost. It has one big city in Addis Ababa. The next biggest city is just 300,000 people. How does this matter? We don't know. It's an interesting stylized fact, but in terms of linking it to this kind of new economic geography literature on agglomeration economies and so on, we still don't know how it matters. In addition to small cities, rural access to cities and markets and services is very poor in Africa. Rural population density is low. Travel time to cities is very low. This is a graph that shows the percentage of the population with access to a 50,000 person city, and it's done by travel times. It's a bit like a cumulative distribution function. And you can see that the real interest is in people with kind of 3 to 5 hours of access to cities, and there's a huge variation. You have relatively high population density in countries like Malawi, but Ethiopia and Mozambique, many people still have very poor access to cities. The only good news is there's been some improvements. The dotted line, for example, for Ethiopia shows the situation in '94, whereas the solid red line shows the situation in 2007. There's been dramatic improvements based on road investments mostly. So it is possible to improve this situation. And then, of course, there's been a massive boom in mobile phone prescriptions. This really matters in terms of economic distance. Penetration, even in rural areas, is quite good. And as of 2009, many African countries were outperforming Asia on this measure, with Ethiopia the main exception. On the other hand, there's very poor access to things like electricity, improved toilets and sanitation, improved water. And in African countries, this is broken up by cities of different sizes. You can see even that small cities in Africa perform worse than rural areas in Asia. And there's a huge difference between cities, suggesting there's possibly a big city bias. And this matters a lot in terms of manufacturing, obviously. You need electricity for manufacturing and also for the development of the rural non-farm sector. And this graph shows the rural non-farm sector in Africa is really quite small. In terms of the demographic transition, these issues matter a lot too, because Africa is really going to need employment over the next 40 years. This is the ratio of working age people to the dependent population, with estimates, with forecasts up to 2050. And you can see that while these ratios are going down in most of Asia, it's going to be rising up until 2050 and beyond in Africa. So Africa is starting its demographic transition and really needs jobs for young people. And finally, within agriculture, I think we've seen a fairly limited transformation, although maybe some improvements in recent years. We've seen declining taxation of agriculture. This is a measure of real rates of assistance, so negative numbers there show taxation of agriculture. I've highlighted Ghana because we're in Ghana, and Ghana is a classic case study of supposedly taxing the duck that lays the golden eggs in terms of cocoa. But most countries have gotten rid of these distortions over time. But one of the problems with structural adjustment is that the emphasis on agriculture in terms of the public budget has also gone down. This shows shares of government budget, a federal government budget allocated to agriculture. And you'll see that in some countries they're very weak. There are all sorts of caveats with the data there. For example, in Ghana it doesn't include cocoa, and in Nigeria it doesn't include state data, and so on. But in general, most African countries are spending very little on agriculture. They're putting lots of money into education, sometimes into roads, which is good for rural development. But for the most part, they don't seem to be following the kind of intensive agricultural path in other countries. I'll skip this because we go on. There are claims that there's very strong growth in yield in Africa, but it's still a very controversial story. Okay, so I'll skip that since I'm running out of time. But just to conclude, what are the knowledge gaps? There are many knowledge gaps, but here are some of the big ones, I think, in the African context. Why services and not manufacturing? We're seeing this very strong growth in services almost in every African country. I mean, that really is a stylized fact. Why is this? Is it China-Asia competition? Is it high labor costs, weak industrial policies? Is it something to do with the agricultural transformation, mining, remittances? What is it? I don't think we really know. There are lots of good hypotheses, but we're not sure out there. And is this services sector just one of last resort, or are there pull factors, especially for entrepreneurs? Finally, how are these output transformations influenced by rural-urban transformations? I said in Nigeria there's lots of cities, but in Ethiopia and Uganda there's not. But both countries, or both sets of countries, have very limited manufacturing. And what's the role of roads, electricity, and so on? Finally, agriculture is a poverty problem. That's pretty obvious. But is it also a structural transformation problem? The sector is really too big to ignore in Africa. It's a huge sector, but African agriculture obviously looks very different from Asian agriculture for the most part. Different crops, different labor ratios or population densities, and maybe a different political economy too, with the kind of politics of rice being very important in Asia. And how do these differences between Asia and Africa condition within sector and between sector transformation? And how do we optimize agriculture's contribution to structural transformation? And then finally, as Schengen mentioned, is agriculture different today? There's a more open economy, there's also higher food prices, maybe there's more foreign investment coming in too. How does this change things? These seem to be critical questions without very obvious answers. But I think the papers in this conference really make an excellent start on the research side, although I think we can continue to do more in the years to come. And there seems to be increasing interest from the policymakers' side too, perhaps signaling the possibility that African countries are again interested in industrial policies, but still wary of repeating the mistakes of the past. Okay, thank you.